why essentially is it important for us to actually feel our emotions?
Because they're going to come out some other way if we don't. As I said, emotions, and a distinction that's often made is that emotions are a little deeper seated, especially if we're looking at things at the level of the brain, that emotions may be a little core. So when we talk about people may have a tendency towards sadness, a tendency towards being ecstatic, a tendency towards more of that depression or that anxiousness. I think in that context, we're generally talking about emotions, although feelings can be more of they come and go type of thing. So even I feel the need to set that distinction that I may conflate the two in this discussion, but I mean, it's certainly fine to talk about feeling emotions, but I think more correctly, it would be experiencing emotions and feeling feelings. But either way, why it's important is they just are trying to talk yourself out of, I shouldn't be feeling this way is futile, even though a lot of us tend to do that. And often it's because of that experience of believing we're defective for feeling a certain way. Like, I'm crying during this movie. What does that say about me? And then we get into all of this mental talk about how there's something flawed about me. You just feel what you feel. And inevitably, I've seen when people can accept that, they're ultimately in a better position to then be able to feel it or experience it through, and then it can pass. And the longer I've worked as a therapist, specifically specializing in trauma, addiction, grief, and a lot of these things that really rub up against depression and anxiety, that's why people can get into behaviors that don't serve them, because it's this sense of avoid the feeling at all cost. Because maybe we've never been shown or we've never had a good experience that if I just let myself experience this, it's going to pass.
Right.
And so I think that's fundamentally why it's important to encourage and to teach and foster people in the beauty of feeling feelings, experiencing emotion, because it's going to come out in one way or another. And that could be with some of these symptoms we discussed, or it could be in the problematic things we do to try to avoid the symptoms and their feelings. And for many people, that's drinking, drugging, problematic behaviors. It's locking yourself up away, isolating yourself from life so that you never have to feel anything.
Absolutely. So in the beginning of our conversation, we talked about, right, if we stuff our feelings, so to speak, that it can lead to things like obviously physical illness, but also anxiety and depression. So could you break apart those two, and like, how is it that stuffing our feelings can lead to, let's say, anxiety, and how is it that stuffing our feelings can lead to depression?
Sure. And I think it might be useful for me to explain a little bit of how I distinguish the differences between the anxiety and depression, because as a lot of your listeners, I'm sure, are aware, they often exist as two sides of the same coin, right? That many people, it's not one or the other, it's both. And we may have a tendency towards being more depressed, or a tendency towards being more anxious, but often we're dealing with both. And so when I'm looking at anxiety, it's usually a fear of something. Inevitably, when people come to me with issues or concerns or anxious type symptoms, a first question I tend to ask is, what are you afraid of? And often the direct fear, if we're talking about feelings phobia here, is feeling something. And so when people talk about symptoms like panic and dread happening at the level of the body, that's, in my experience, the body speaking for the feelings and the emotions that a person is not allowing themselves to experience. So that is how we can really see it manifest with more of the anxiety threads. And yes, I realize it can be a huge hurdle in treating anxiety to even confront that phobia straight in the face, right? Because phobia just means fear. And we're talking here about feelings phobia. And for people who can get anxious, sometimes the anxiety is about feeling what they need to feel. The anxiety can be around feeling judged, believing that they'll be judged for expressing or feeling a certain thing. But yeah, a lot of especially the physical grade symptoms people talk about with anxiety, it's because something is trying to come out that we're not allowing, or we don't feel that we're able to let it come out.
Mm.
And so it'll manifest as those anxious symptoms. Now, with depression, kind of a working definition of depression is this idea of it's obviously more than sadness, because sadness would be kind of one of those, when I talk about like a feeling state that can come and go, whereas I think depression is more like a day in, day out experience for people, where sadness becomes the norm, where one doesn't potentially feel like there's a way out. And often that comes from this feeling phobia type messaging around belief that I'm defective for feeling the way that I do. Because common negative beliefs that I see people with depression struggle with are things like, I'm not good enough, I'm defective, I'm to blame, it's hopeless, I'm worthless. Those can potentially be things. And often that is the accumulation of these experiences we've never processed, we've never dealt with, and that can stay very, very stuck. And I want to be clear that when we're talking about both anxiety and depression, I'm not saying that for some, there isn't like a legitimate organic cause to it that could be helped with something like medication. So I'm definitely not advocating that any listener just like go off any treatment that they're on unless they get proper supervision for that. But I would ask you to consider, in working with your own tendency towards anxiety or depression, has the lure been more, let me just get on the right thing so I don't necessarily feel this way anymore? When the key may be, what is it I need to feel?
Right.
That can be the way out. Because I think in both cases, even though the expressions may be different, a big common thread is we're stuffing what we may need to feel, or we're negating or denying our right to feel what we feel and experience what we need to experience.
That's, yeah, what an interesting topic. What an interesting, right? It's all like folding over in and on itself, right? Being afraid to feel something and therefore then leading to anxiety and or depression, which we might not want to feel that way. So then it's just this, like
vicious cycle, and in the truest sense of the term, it's a vicious cycle.
Yeah. Oh.
And it's interesting because in this piece I wrote on feelings phobia not too long ago, I cite the story of a friend of mine who was talking a little bit about their treatment that they've received in a very kind of traditional medical model type of way for anxiety over the years. And I was going on my usual soapbox, as I'm doing now, about, hey, you got to feel it through. The easiest way out is through, and what you stuff is going to come out in one way or another. And my friend said to me very plainly, well, I thought the point wasn't to get engulfed by my feelings, to like not engage them, to kind of keep them at bay and let rational reason kind of take over and help me see perspective. And of course, I kind of flinched because I knew that was either advice or a direction being given by somebody who was pretty medical model, or that's a lot of what we see in more the cognitive behavioral model that's more cognitively focused. Like, don't let your feelings get the best of you. Look at your thoughts. But the reality is, when our feelings are running amok and causing charge in our body, that will override our ability to even think rationally or see clearly.
Right.
And I think that's the advice that a lot of people are getting, even from the mental health field as well. Don't engage the feelings, because your feelings will get the best of you. Even in 12-step recovery, there's this very popular slogan of, don't act on emotion, but like I over E, intellect over emotion. And the reality is we need both of them, because I see so many people then trying to get so stuck up in their head coming up with the solution because they're afraid their emotions are going to get the best of them. But then as a result, they're cutting off a huge part of their experience that's even causing the problem. And for example, in a lot of the more mindfulness informed ways of looking at mental health and treatment, we talk about this idea of wise mind, which is allowing it all to come together. Your thoughts, your feelings, your sensations. In EMDR therapy, which is the main therapy I practice and teach, that's the big appeal of it to me, is that we really want to help people look at the total picture. And a lot of that means training people to even be okay with emotions and body sensations in the first place. Because as a people, we tend to be so stuck in our heads because we have this fear of even going to the emotional. Yet so much of what mental illness or distress is about is our emotions are just screaming for our attention.
Avaya has changed my life.
Avaya has made me the woman I am today.
Avaya is my home.
Avaya is personal freedom.
Avaya is the reason my life continuously improves.
Let everyone in your life know about Avaya.
Everyone needs to know about this amazing company.
Thank you, Avaya, for appearing in my inbox.
What Ike Allen and Andy Anderson have created at Avaya is what the world needs.